Okay, guys, sorry about missing last week. It's been a pretty tumultuous little time in the McMichael household, but things are going along okay, and I'm back at it. We're almost at the end of the semester. We've got 1 week left, and I think we're all going to get there. I'm pretty happy with the way that people are starting to get caught up, and I want to emphasize that all of the materials, all of the tests and quizzes and assignments are all still up, and you can go back and make those up at any time. But the clock is ticking, so once we get to the time that my grades are due, and I'm assuming they'll be due on Monday after our last week, so that's going to be the cutoff. And so if you're behind on something, you want to get caught up, please do. Um, Look back through and see if you've gotten everything. If people are missing stuff as we get down towards the very end, I may send out an email saying, here's what you're missing. Um, but we're getting there, and like all these things do, eventually it comes to an end, and we will have survived. Um, this week's questions mainly are about the Black Death. There were a lot of questions about that, about what the plague was all about. There's pretty scary stuff in our book, this description of this worldwide pandemic that obliterated half the world at that time. We do have in our culture a kind of fascination with these things. Think of the Walking Dead or any of the zombie plague movies that have come out. We have this. We're kind of scared of this when the Ebola thing was going on. And of course we have the AIDS epidemic, which when it first started, people were terrified of. There was some speculation in the beginning of the AIDS crisis because the Reagan administration did such a terrible job of educating people that this was going to be some kind of pandemic again, that we didn't know. The government was giving us absolutely no information on how AIDS was being spread. And so people were like, can you catch it from, breathing on somebody? Can you catch it from a handshake? Nobody knew. And, I lay that at the foot of the Reagan administration. They didn't want to say the word gay. They really didn't want to do that. And so, and for that reason it was spread. Ignorance is the enemy of humanity when it comes to these kinds of things. And that's true also of the Black Death. I mean, one of the reasons it was so terrible was ignorance, for the most part. If you want to say, why was this as bad as it was? And it's that people had no idea what was causing it or what to do about it. And, they hadn't even developed a germ theory yet by then. In the 1300s, people didn't know how people got sick. They didn't know about bacteria. They didn't know about viruses. They didn't know any of this stuff. And so for them, it was a mystery. You just see people dying everywhere, and we don't know why or how. And of course, then a lot of craziness ensued from that, with people trying to find a way to survive. Um, and so, specifically what kinds of ignorance led to this? And it was ignorance about um, the medical processes involved in the spread of the plague. People associated the plague with rats pretty early on. It seemed like wherever there were lots of rats, there were more people dying. But they did not realize it was the fleas that were on the rats that were causing this, that the fleas were biting the rats, fleas were biting people, and spreading the disease in that way. Now, we don't get bitten by fleas much anymore. Right? I doubt there's any of us who have ever experienced a flea bite. The fleas that our dogs and cats get don't really bite people for some reason. The fleas that were on the black rats and that there's a kind of flea, and they still exist in other parts of the world, and I'm sure there's a few over here. I don't know. I didn't look up where these fleas are, but I know that you don't get bitten by fleas. But people in the Middle Ages in Europe in the 1300s, they were getting bitten by fleas all the time. That was just a common thing. If you were a live human being on the planet, you had been bitten by a flea several times. And that comes right back to hygiene, right? It's just simple things like don't let bugs bite you. Find a way to keep these bugs. If there's rats everywhere, you might want to do something about that. People really didn't have the wherewithal to get that done, nor the understanding that this was vitally, vitally important. You see this still in the third world in many cases. My wife did a medical mission in Guatemala years ago that I went with her on, and one of the things that she said was, you can tell how sick people are by what their fingernails look like. Honestly, she said, just look at their fingernails and you can tell. If you got kids with dirty fingernails, you're going to have parasites. You're going to the best thing that she could do, she said, for this community in this mountainous area of Guatemala is teach them to wash their hands. How important it is to wash your hands. And people just don't know that in those areas. There's still a lot of ignorance. There's still a lot of darkness in this world. And but in the dark ages, right, it was really dark. And so ignorance about basic hygiene, about basic germ theory, all this stuff contributed to the devastation of the Black Death, the plague. Um, Another thing that it contributed to was war. War. I mean, just blows my mind how stupid human beings can be. Um, the first incident where the plague shows up in Europe, right? And of course, we know it came out of China in the East, and we don't get a lot of stuff. Most of our book is on. There is some stuff about China and Asia and different parts of the world. They do a pretty good job of giving us kind of global perspective, but most of our book is focused on your typical Western civilization stuff. And we know that it decimated Europe. It took out half the population, but it did that everywhere. It started in the East, and in China, and in the Middle East, and everywhere. It was a worldwide pandemic. Now, we don't know about what would happen on the American and South American continents because no one had been there yet. Um, so evidently it didn't get there, or it may not have gone there. We know very little about plagues in that part of the world. Um, so, there's an interesting history there that I think is fascinating. That evidently, and this is something scientists have just now, or historians and scientists, archaeologists, have discovered, is that there was a terrible plague on the North American continent right before the first settlers from the West get there. So you have the story of the Pilgrims, right? And they land at Plymouth Rock, and they're starving through the winter, and they're dying. And this one Indian comes and saves them and shows them how to plant and stuff. Evidently, he was the only survivor of his whole community. Everyone else was dead. There were millions of people, apparently, Native American people, who were not there when the first colonists show up to the New World, which, of course, made a huge difference in how the people from Europe got a foothold in the New World. And so, there's that history. And we don't know what plague it was that wiped out the native populations, but evidently it happened. And uh, diseases, pandemics are a big part of human history. And thank goodness we haven't experienced any in a while. But there's that constant fear that we could. Now, the fact that we do have germ theory, we do know how diseases are spread, we do have weapons to deploy against these things, makes it less likely to be as bad as it can get. But still, they're worried right now about the plague itself. There is a penicillin-resistant strain of that stuff somewhere. It shows up, I think, in Australia maybe. And it hasn't gone anywhere, but there it is, right? So what happens if the thing mutates suddenly? And now you've got the bubonic plague, again, well, it would be terrible, but not as terrible as the Middle Ages because I'm not letting a bunch of rats in my house, right? I'm not going to be living in those kind of conditions, if at all possible, that would allow the plague to spread the way that it did. But back to the war situation. The One of the Mongol leaders, his name was Jani Beg. What a name, Jani Beg. Was the leader of the Mongol hordes, the Golden Horde, in the early 1300s, and he was besieging the city of Kaffa, which is in the Crimea. And of course, the Mongols are coming out of the east, right? Plagues in the east, and his army was suffering from the plague. And so he got the bright idea to launch the dead bodies of his plague soldiers over the walls of the city of Kaffa and infect the city with the plague. And some merchants broke out of the city and sailed off, and they landed in Sicily. And that's how the plague got to Europe, because of a Mongol warlord's decision to engage in germ warfare in a primitive way. And so, as with all of these kinds of natural disasters, you see that There is the disaster itself that's just nobody's fault. There's things out there, it's getting people, but people tend to make it worse and not better. And that's something we got to know about this. I mean, I can go back to this recent history that I dealt with the Reagan administration, the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. There's a lot of tragedy there. There's a lot of really bad things that happened because people didn't make good decisions about how to deal with this epidemic. And so that's our challenge, is to say, when we're confronted with these things, to make good decisions, to do things that make it better and not worse. Because that's the tragic history of humanity, is that when we run into these kinds of situations, we tend to make it worse. And so hopefully we won't see another one in our lifetime, but who knows? Now, one thing to know is that the population of the Earth decreased by half. Right? So pretty much if you average out all the numbers and all the places that the plague hit, it ends up being about a 50% reduction of the world's population. So it went from 400 million to about 200 million, a little over 200 million, in 100 years. So from 1300 to 1400, we lost about half of the world's population. And looking at those population numbers, there's something interesting to know. And I don't think your book really points this out, and I think it's important. That worldwide population is, we can't imagine how much fewer people there were on the planet as we go back into the past. So if you're looking at, I've got numbers here, if you're looking at the beginning of human history, right? The beginning of history. So we're looking around 5,000 years ago is when you start getting written history. And that's kind of where our book starts, because you don't have anything with these prehistoric, tools and stuff and cave paintings. And then you've got written records of some kind happening in Egypt and in Babylon around 5,000 years ago. And at that time, there were only 5 million people on the planet. So 5,000 years ago, when we begin with beginning of human history, right, there's 5 million people alive on Earth. And now we have 6 billion people alive on Earth. That's a lot more people. And so one of the things to know as we look back into this past is that the human population was not as big as it is now. And if you do, the scientists have done, you go back into prehistory, you can look at genetics in a certain way. Now, I don't know the science on this. I'm taking their word for it. But if you look at the genetic markers in people, you'll find that they share an ancestry. Basically, all of our genetics boils down to, we all share common ancestors as we go further and further back. And apparently we're all related to people about 70,000 years ago. There's about 1,000 people alive on Earth. That all of our genetics comes from that population group. So at some point, as we go back into deep prehistory, were almost no human beings alive. There's a number of theories for why that may have happened. One of them is the Toba catastrophe. There's a supervolcano in Sumatra, in Indonesia, that blew up. And a supervolcano it's called a caldera volcano. It doesn't make a mountain. It's so massive that when the volcano erupts, the earth just caves in and you get a gigantic depression. So there's this gigantic, almost an ocean, a lake in Sumatra, where this volcano was. And what this does is pumps ungodly amounts of ash and dust into the air, which would then create winter for several years. Things wouldn't grow, and you'd have this massive die-off of populations, including human beings. And that's one theory for why that happened. Other people challenge, say, no, that's probably not. But regardless of it, it's true that we all share the genetic markers of about, going all the way back there to about 1,000 people. And I think that's significant to think about, as you go into, as we look back in this ancient history, just how few people were around when a lot of this stuff happens. And then looking forward, how many people can this planet support? There were a lot of theories in the 70s that by now we'd all be starving to death because worldwide population would just not be able to be sustained. A number of things happened to keep that from being the truth. A lot more advancements in agriculture. In many ways our technology has saved us. We're able to produce a lot more food in today than we could even in the 1950s and 60s. And so we're doing okay, but we better keep on doing okay. We got to keep on producing more food, and for our exploding population. And populations have declined somewhat. It's nothing as our human culture changes, and one of the ways human culture has changed is in the idea of having smaller families, especially in Western developed countries. Uh, we tend to say we're going to be doing other things besides just focusing on having kids. The availability of birth control, the understanding of how to use it, all these different things have changed so that these dire predictions of overpopulation have not come to pass. But at one time, in the 60s and 70s, people were seriously worried about this. And I'm not so sure we shouldn't still be a little bit worried about it, because when you go from um, 5 million to 6 billion in 5,000 years, right? Well, how populations increase exponentially. And so, it's something to think about. Um, Last question I want to deal with is with Petrarch. People were questions about Petrarch and him copying these manuscripts, and it's an interesting thing to talk about because it clarifies some issues. And one of the questions was, why did he write down this stuff? Why was he copying these books from these classical Greek and Roman authors? And uh, what I want to do is talk about the Dark Ages. We have this idea of Dark Ages, and it's a problematic term because people use it in different ways. In general, right? If you are watching a TV show and it says it's set in the Dark Ages, right? You're thinking kings and castles and knights and you know basically the Middle Ages. Well, the Middle Ages are a long time. Right? We're talking about the fall of Rome happening around 400 AD, some in there, and then Rome kind of begins to crumble and fall apart, and the Germanic tribes sweep in, and we have this gradual decline of this great worldwide empire, and all this learning and stuff kind of starts to get lost. Um, you have this kind of gradual accretion, where accretion is not the right word, gradual disintegration. Um, Rome falls, and the civic centers of Roman life kind of take a hit. And all of that lifestyle of living in cities and having lots of time on your hands, right, to write stuff down, um, that just kind of declines. And there's no printing press. And so books actually just get lost. That's what blows my mind, is this stuff that just got lost. Like, we know because other authors reference books by Plato, for instance, that we simply don't have. They're not in existence anymore. And it doesn't mean they can't be found. They still do make these discoveries sometimes, usually in monasteries, right? Because that's what happened, is the church, after the fall of Rome, the church became the center of learning. And so if you were going to learn anything, if you're going to be a literate person, you had to be in a monastery, basically. That's how you became an educated person. And the monasteries treasured up these ancient documents and copied them by hand as a way of preserving them. And so when Petrarch was going and looking for these things, he was looking in monasteries a lot, right? He was trying to find this stuff by going back to these medieval sources or earlier medieval sources that had preserved them. And, we kind of owe the church a debt of gratitude for that, because this stuff would have been lost completely had they not decided to hold on to it. Um, and so, that also created a whole model of learning that, by the way, is dying for the first time since then, which is a significant thing. When we're reading about these things, these changes in the past, these changes that have happened in human culture, we don't realize that we're living in the middle of changes as significant or more significant than the ones we've read about in our book. And this is one of those changes. The fact that I'm talking to you on an online course right now, you are not coming to me at a building somewhere with a library. From the time the church began to build the monasteries and their libraries of classical documents, that mode of learning has been in place from then until now. And now, for the first time in the last 20, 30 years, you've moved from a situation where, like, when I went to school in 1985, I'm old, um, you had to go to the college because that's where the library was. If you're going to learn something, of course you went there for the professors and for, all the other stuff, but the main thing was the library. There's just one place to get this stuff, and there it is. And so you needed to be physically close to a library where you could go in and physically take the books off the shelf to read them, to be a scholar. And like I said, that was true going all the way back to the early Middle Ages. And now it's different. We don't have to do that anymore. And you're going to see, I promise you, this is coming. All right, just get ready for it because it's coming. There's going to be an enormous change in how education happens eventually. Right? Colleges cannot, I shouldn't say it's, I'm working for a college, right? You're paying I'm not getting paid much, but you're paying me, right? But this information, everything that I have taught you, everything that this course has taught you, is available for free online. You could look this up yourself. You could literally just say, go to Google and say, who was Petrarch? Right? And spend hours and hours learning about Petrarch. You could do that. And so, that state of the change in the way the information is shared is going to change the way education happens. Your kids and their kids are going to be living in a very different world when it comes to education. But Petrarch, what he was doing was he was trying to recover this knowledge by going back to these ancient documents and copying them out. And then about 100 years after Petrarch's death, you get the printing press, which helps with this a lot, right? As soon as you get a printing press, as soon as you can start printing materials cheaply, so that the book isn't basically priceless. You get the letter in a book about he's borrowed this book, this Cicero, from a friend. Well, you have to realize that there are not very many of these books on the planet. With that book of Cicero, there may have been 400 or 500 of those, if that, in the world. And so these were precious things. And copying them out by hand then was a worthwhile enterprise because it's a priceless artifact when you've got, I have a copy of this book. The printing press comes along and all that gets, like we can make millions of these. And so that changes, and it was one of the things that moves the information age a little closer is the ability to print stuff. But Petrarch comes along before that, and so he's involved in copying things down. And he was the first person to use the term Dark Ages. And so what he's looking at is he's going back to all these ancient Latin and Greek manuscripts and saying, wow, this is great stuff. Nothing is happening right now. Nothing that's been happening since then has been anything like this. So he called these the age he was living in, and down back to the dissolution of the Roman Empire, he called that the Dark Ages. Now, people kind of latched onto that. The Protestants, 100 years later, when you get the Protestant Reformation, they call all the ages where the Catholic Church was the only Christian church the Dark Ages, right? Because then they were bringing in the new and more enlightened Christianity. So this word Dark Ages kind of gets thrown around in that way. And I think it's unfair to some degree because there was a lot of stuff going on in the Middle Ages that wasn't dark at all. There were the trade guilds, and there were all kinds of things about that civilization that were beautiful. But knowledge and learning wasn't one of them. And the Black Plague kind of swept in, and that culture was incredibly vulnerable to a pandemic just because of how little they knew. And we can thank our lucky stars that we live in a civilization where we know this stuff. And so that's it for the video lecture for this course. I'll do another one next week, and that'll be the last one, and then we will wrap this thing up. I've said this every time. I'm going to say it again. If you need to get in touch with me, get in touch with me. This is the first online class I've taught in this way, and it concerns me that I don't know you guys. I don't hear from you. I don't talk to you. I don't know who you are, and it just feels like in some ways I'm teaching to this void out there. So please get in touch with me if you need to get in touch with me. If you have questions, whatever, if you're going to need to catch up, if you need help with something, get in touch with me. Like I said, I've given you my cell phone in the syllabus, and you can also hit me with the course messages or emails. So that's it for this week, and I will have week 8 up sometime on Sunday night. Thanks.